Hi, my name is Maya Pidioska.
I'm Riley Ponce.
And I'm Zari Lee Rubis.
And this is
Crab Course.
Crab Course!
In this video, we're going to be talking about the Belgium imperialistic expansion in the Congo that started in 1885 and lasted in 1960. So, Belgium, located in Western Europe, is the imperialist country of this video, and the Congo, located in Central Africa, is a dependent colony. It is significant that Belgium is located in Europe because it portrays a redundant pattern where European nations would take over African colonies. This is known as the Scramble for Africa. The Scramble for Africa is the invasion, division, and colonization of African colonies over a very brief period of time, also known as the New Imperialism. Belgium was a very small and unimportant country in the 19th century, so they needed to enrich and strengthen themselves. So they decided to conquer the Congo. From Belgium's perspective, the Congolese were irrelevant and even needed their help as stated in the white man's burden, which was a concept that the white race was superior to all others and that the less involved races needed to be cared for. An American journalist that visited the Belgian Congo in the 19th century is named Henry Morton Stanley. He described Africa as a sunless expanse of jungle and that they needed the Europeans. In addition to being a journalist, Stanley got signatures from the local chiefs to legitimize the Leopold's takeover. After he took over, King Leopold forced the Congolese to work, producing rubber, copper, and ivory. He would then sell the resources and keep all the profit for Belgium. King Leopold believed he was doing the right thing for their nation, even though he was hurting the Congolese. Now that we've seen that Belgium treated and thought of Congo poorly, let's move on to the perspective of the Congolese. The Congolese despised Belgium. Once they took over, a majority of them died of either starvation or physical abuse. Their limbs would also be cut off if they didn't do their job properly, which is actually a very strange method of punishing them because they would get less work done. The Congolese were terrified because King Leopold created a violent military squad called the Force Publique. The police force, or the Force Publique, regularly tortured them, particularly by cutting off hands, as I mentioned before, and murdering the indigenous people. The force was armed with modern weaponry, which made it even more terrifying. The Congolese would work all day and get no education. This included the children. As for their land, it all got taken away except a few tiny, usually damaged villages that belonged to them. After Belgium Congo was created, many things changed. The long-term effects for the people under colonial rule was that the Congo became one of the poorest countries because of the instability of it all. There was also a heavy death toll and a loss of land. Lastly, forced labor was there for many, many years. Well, that's all for me. Next up, Riley.
Thank you, Maya. As Maya had mentioned, Belgium is a considerably small nation, consisting of a population of 6,500,000 people, and compared to the other nations of Europe that colonized Africa, this is considerably small. And so with such a small population, they even had a smaller military, consisting of 0 warships. So you might be wondering, how did Belgium gain a whole empire, and one that was so successful in gathering resources and gaining riches from it? Well, it all started with the Scramble of Africa. This is under the condition that trade of its natural resources would have to be open to all nations. Once Leopold was given this land, he convinced the European powers that he would do everything in his power to Christianize the Congo, as well as the slave trade region, to better the lives of the native people. Instead of doing so, he created a mainly rubber production system ran by enslaved Congolese. Leopold also used other resources like ivory to personally enrich himself. The Scramble of Africa was a way for European powers to prevent conflict with each other by dividing up the continent of Africa and giving each of parts of the land to the Europeans in order for them to take over. Initially, the Congo was desired by all nations because of the profit they could make from the main commodity of rubber. This caused major conflict between the nations. Then King Leopold II proposed to take the land of the Congo. Surprisingly, Germany, France, and Britain agreed that King Leopold could have the nation. Not Belgium, but King Leopold himself. This is under the condition that trade of its natural resources would have to be open to all nations. Once Leopold was given this land, he convinced the European powers that he would do everything in his power to Christianize the Congo, as well as the slave trade region, to better the lives of the native people. Instead of doing so, he created a mainly rubber production system ran by enslaved Congolese. Leopold also used other resources like ivory to personally enrich himself. If the Congolese failed to meet the rubber production quotas, the punishment was death or mutilation, of amputation of hand or foot. About half of the Congolese population died from punishment and malnutrition, and many others suffered from disease and torture. His horrible treatment of the Congolese would eventually become a problem that threatens his ownership of the territory. The terrible treatment of the natives led to a lot of international criticism from the United States and many European people. They were against these abuses and even spoke out with demonstrations and protests demanding Leopold to end the abuse of human rights in the Congo Free State. If the Congolese failed to meet the rubber production quotas, the punishment was death or mutilation, of amputation of hand or foot. About half of the Congolese population died from punishment and malnutrition, and many others suffered from disease and torture. His horrible treatment of the Congolese would eventually become a problem that threatens his ownership of the territory. The terrible treatment of the natives led to a lot of international criticism from the United States and many European people. They were against these abuses and even spoke out with demonstrations and protests demanding Leopold to end the abuse of human rights in the Congo Free State. Eventually, in 1908, international pressure forced the king to turn the Congo Free State over to the country of Belgium. Soon after, Leopold had passed away. After Belgium annexed the colony, they firstly closed down the trade while reforms were undertaken. The British refused to acknowledge the annexation. Belgium was now afraid that Britain was going to take part of the Congo. However, Britain didn't even want the Congo. There were discussions of either taking or forcibly purchasing these lands. In the 1911 Agadir crisis, Germany demanded some sort of compensation for the French annexation of Morocco. France had originally given this land to Germany in Central Africa. Belgium started to engage with Germany in ways of alliance. This threatened France and Britain due to the fact that in event of war, Belgium could bring German troops into France and wouldn't give Britain enough time to intervene. Eventually, in 1913 June, Britain recognized the annexation of the Congo, and Belgium would get to keep its empire. The newly named Belgium Congo remained a colony until the Democratic Republic of Congo gained its independence in 1960.
Thanks, Riley. As she said, the Congo was declared an independent state in 1960, but the lead to freedom started years before. In the 1950s, there was a rise of political parties led by educated Congolese elites. The Parti Solidaire Africain, referred to in this video as the PSA, and the Alliance des Congo were allies against the Belgian rule and were the two largest and most influential parties. Antoine Gizenga was the president of National Central Committee of the Parti Solidaire Africain, which was the committee that ran the PSA, and he eventually became the Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 2006 to 2008. Sylvain Kama was the director of National Political Bureau, which was where they thought about things and discussed actions before the party actually took them. Cleophas Kamitatu was the president of Kitwit PSA Committee, the branch that dealt with rural areas instead of urban cities. Before this period, there were tensions between Catholic and Protestant missionaries who had arrived to the Congo shortly before King Leopold II established his personal ownership of the territory. Both religious groups blamed the other for any anti-colonial whispers because in order to keep government support, they had to maintain a certain level of loyalty to the imperial regime. Catholics related indigenous resistance movements to the Protestant ideas of individualism and religious freedom. The Protestants blamed it on the Catholics' abuse of the native Congolese. Congolese people reinterpreted Christianity for themselves and within found revolutionary ideas of justice over oppression. Congolese Protestants began demanding leadership positions in their churches, and these demands helped spark the national independence movement. Some scholars who wrote about this topic said that Congolese Christians took full advantage of the educational and leadership opportunities that church affiliation provided under the colonial system. These opportunities led to the educated elite that is seen in the political parties. Over time, many missionaries grew to support the independence struggle because they saw the suffering that was a result of the colonial system and felt that it was against their Christian morals. The PSA pushed for immediate independence from Belgium and gained lots of support from rural populations. On January 15th of 1959, riots broke out at the capital, which was then called Leopoldville, because the Belgian administration was not allowing members of the Alliance des Congo to assemble. People began protesting in small ways, such as talking back refusing to stand at attention in front of a Belgian authority, purposely responding slowly to questions or orders, and even sometimes engaging in altercations with Europeans. As more people began protesting, the PSA and the Alliance des Congo started providing services such as healthcare, judicial systems, and tax help to the people, and kind of formed into quasi-governmental organizations. The PSA strongly emphasized a nonviolent campaign and vocally discouraged violence and publicly apologized if any did occur. Later, in 1959, the Belgian government created sort of a puppet election for Congolese officials to try and quell any thoughts of rebellion or independence. Only men could vote, of course, and they basically said, guys, you don't need independence. See? We let some of you guys be government authorities. Obviously, the PSA and the Alliance des Congo saw right through this and boycotted the election. This boycott was very successful, but the Belgian government tried to stop it by arresting any man who didn't register and threatening a fine of 500 francs and 7 days in prison. The boycott showed the Belgians that the Congolese were intent on independence and were not going to stay under their rule for that much longer. On January 20th, 1960, Belgium invited members from 13 different political parties to the roundtable talks in Brussels. At the conference in Brussels, Belgium proposed a long process to freedom that would span the next 3 to 4 years, but the Congolese demanded immediate independence because they were not going to wait 3 to 4 years for, independence, and they did not back down until the Belgian government agreed. A couple months before independence, in May of 1960, the Congolese elected Joseph Kasavubu as their president and Patrice Lumumba as the prime minister. A Senate and Assembly and other similar positions were elected in the many other provinces of the area, but shortly after the elections, the still very young PSA started to fall apart due to power differences, contrasting beliefs, and conflicts between ethnicities. As we know, when Europe drew up the borders for Africa, during the scramble for Africa, they paid no attention to native African borders and squashed people of completely different cultures all into one colony. As you can see, that would create a lot of tension. And so when they were trying to get independence and, trying to govern themselves, they had a hard time doing that because it was just people who were completely unalike trying to work together. On July 5th of 1960, very shortly after independence, the Force Publique rebelled against their white Belgian commanders, seeking higher wages and more opportunity for advancement. The coup spread across the very young nation, and the army was renamed the Congolese National Army. A full-blown crisis had begun and lasted for the next 5 years. This was called the Congo Crisis.
This is all we have for you today. I hope you learned a lot from this video.
This was Crab Course.
Thank you for watching.